Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. Peter breaks through. Our children, except one, must grow up. The way Wendy knew was this. One day when she was a very little girl, she picked a flower from the garden to show her mother. Mrs. Darling held the flower over her heart. "Oh, Wendy," she said with a laughing smile, "why can't you stay like this forever?" Wendy was just 2 years old, but from the moment on she knew that she must grow up. Wendy's mother was a lovely lady. Mr. Darling knew that when he married her. He loved her, and she loved him. He liked to boast that she also respected him, which she did. At first, the Darlings worried if they could afford children. But before each child was born, Mrs. Darling said, "Of course we can, George. We'll watch every Of course we can, George. We'll watch every penny." First came Wendy, then John, and Michael was last. The Darlings had a nurse for the children because Mrs. Darling liked everything just so, and Mr. Darling wanted to be just like their neighbors. But since they were poor, the nurse was Nana, a very proper Newfoundland dog that found in Kensington Gardens. Nana was a very good nurse. She learned to be a nurse by watching the other nurses in the park. She made sure the children bathed properly. She knew when a cough was just a cough and nothing serious. And if one of them cried at night, she was up in an instant to see why. They were easy because she lived in the children's room. When the children started school, Nana made sure they got ready. She walked primarily alongside them, butting anyone who strayed out of line. She made sure John didn't forget his soccer sweater, and if it looked like rain, she carried an umbrella in her mouth. At school, Nana stayed in the basement where the children sat in classrooms upstairs. Nana didn't like Mrs. Darling's friends to make surprise visits to the children's room, but if they came, she quickly dressed Micah in a clean outfit, brushed Wendy's hair, and tried her best to do something with John's hair. She was a very proper nurse, even though Mr. Darling wondered if the neighbors thought it odd to have a dog for a nurse. After all, he had his position in the city to consider. There never was a happier family until the coming of Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling first heard of Peter while tidying up her children's minds when they were asleep. Children don't know mothers do this, but they do. It's a little like tidying up drawers. Every child has a special place called Neverland, filled with strange and wonderful spots that are his or her very own. Every Neverland is different. Some have rivers and leaves, and gnomes and princesses and caves on every kind. Others, like John's, had a lagoon where he lived on the sand in a boat turned upside down. Michael's also had a lagoon, but he lived on the sand. He lived in the wigwam, where Wendy's had a house made of leaves. Neverland is filled with wonderful adventures at night, just before you go to sleep. It seems very, very real. Mrs. Darling did not know anyone named Peter, but there he was in each child's mind. "Who is Peter?" she asked Wendy. "He is Peter Pan," Wendy replied. At first, Mrs. Darling was puzzled. Then she remembered her own childhood and someone called Peter Pan, who was said to live with fairies. People said he comforted children. Mrs. Darling believed in him then. But he's growing up now, she said to Wendy. Oh no, Wendy said, he isn't growing up at all. And he's just my size. When Mrs. Darling told Mr. Darling about Peter Pan, he laughed and said it was some of Nana's nonsense. Forget it and it will go away, he said. But it didn't. One morning, Wendy awoke to find tree leaves scattered about the bedroom floor. They weren't there when she and the boys had gone to bed. Oh, it was just Peter, she said when her mother asked how they got there. He didn't wipe his feet, and he should when he comes in the window. Wendy smiled. Sometimes he comes in at night and plays his pipes at the foot of my bed, she said. Mrs. Darling was shocked. Well, you must have been dreaming, she said. But the leaves were real and came from a tree she had never seen before. Wendy had not been dreaming, and the very next night an extraordinary adventure began. It was Nana's night off, so Mrs. Darling took the children into bed. She gazed at them tenderly as she sat by the fireplace to sew. So the fire was warm, and she began to doze. While she slept, she had a dream. In the dream, Neverland came much too near, and a strange boy got out. The boy had torn the curtain that usually covers Neverland, and Wendy and John and Micah were peeking through. Mrs. Darling dreamed the nursery window blew open and a boy flew into the room. She thought she recognized him. At his side was a tiny bright light, no bigger than the first. It darted through the room as if it were alive. The strange light awakened Mrs. Darling. She put her hand to her mouth in surprise, for she knew at once that the boy was Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling cried out at the sight of the strange boy. At that moment, Nana entered the room, back from her evening out. She too saw the boy, and not knowing what to think, leaped at him with a fierce growl. Chapter 2. The Shadow. Peter nimbly darted to the window with Nana snapping at his toes. He quickly leaped through the open windows, which closed with a bang behind him. Mrs. Darling cried out again, for she was certain the boy was killed. After all, the children's room was quite a distance from the street. She ran to the window to see where he had fallen, but the street was clear. Mrs. Darling looked into the dark night sky. It was empty except for a bright shooting star. Nana stood by the window, clutching something in her mouth. It was the boy's shadow. The closing window had torn it off as neatly as a sheet of paper from a roll. It was an ordinary shadow, and Nana knew immediately what to do. She hung it out the window so the boy could find it without disturbing the children. We can't leave it here. We can't leave it there, Mrs. Darling said. It will look like wash hung out dry. What would the neighbors think? She thought to show the shadow to Mr. Darling, but he would only say, "That's what happens when you have a dog for a nurse." Since she had to do something, Mrs. Darling rolled up the shadow and tucked it away in a drawer. She would leave it there until the right time came to tell her husband what had happened. The right time came the very next Friday. It was a day the Darlings would never, ever forget. I should have known to be more careful on a Friday, Mrs. Darling said later. Mr. Darling patted her tenderly on the shoulder. "No, my dear," he said. "I am responsible for what happened." "No, it was my fault," Mrs. Darling replied. Then they could not agree on who was to blame, nor could they forget the events on that fateful day. "If only I had not accepted the invitation to dine at our neighbor's," Mrs. Darling said. "If only I had not poured my medicine into Nana's bowl." Mr. Darling said. Nana's eyes clouded up as if to say, if only I had pretended to like the medicine. Mr. Darling wiped away Nana's tears. Each one felt they alone were to blame, and sometimes they blamed Peter. That fiend, Mr. Darling would cry, to which Nana barked in agreement. But Mrs. Darling never blamed Peter. And so they sat in the empty nursery night after night, remembering the events of that dreadful Friday night. It had started quite ordinarily. Nana filled Micah's bath and carried him to it on her broad back. I won't go to bed, Micah protested, as if he made the rules. I won't. Mrs. Darling entered the nursery wearing a lovely evening gown. Around her neck was the necklace Mr. Darling had given to her, and on her wrist was Wendy's bracelet, which she borrowed. Wendy loved to see her dressed so pretty. Wendy and John were pretending to be Mr. and Mrs. Darling. First, John said, Mrs. Darling, you have a baby daughter. Hearing that, Wendy danced for joy, just as her mother must have done when she was born. Then John said, and now you have a baby son, meaning himself when he was born. Wendy smiled brightly at the news. I want to be born too, Micah said as he came from his bath. We don't want any more children, John said. Micah's face clouded and he nearly burst into tears. Nobody wants me, he said. I do, Wendy said. Micah was not sure what she meant. A boy or a girl? He asked. A boy, Wendy shouted, and Micah leaped happily into her arms. Later, the Darlings and Nana remembered that last night the children were in the nursery. That was when I dashed in, wasn't it? Mr. Darling said, interrupting their reminiscence. That night, Mr. Darling had also dressed for their dinner out, but he could not tie his tie. He rushed into the nursery when an untied tie dangling from his head. This tie refuses to tie around my neck, he said. It does quite well around the bedpost. But if it will not tie around my neck, we will not go to dinner. If we didn't go to dinner, I won't ever go to my office again. If I don't go to the office, we shall starve and our children will be thrown into the street. Mrs. Darling was calm. Let me do it, dear, she said, because she knew that exactly what he'd come for. The children gathered around to lean if they would be thrown into the streets or not. With quick hands, Mrs. Darling tied the rebellious tie. Once it was done, Mr. Darling relaxed. Soon the whole family was dancing gaily around the room. What fun it was, Mrs. Darling said, recalling the Friday night, our last romp together. Mr. Darling said with a sigh. Mrs. Darling's face turned sad. They were ours, and now they are gone, she said, but even the sadness could not stop Darling's memories of that night. Soon Nana joined the happy throng. As she romped amid the flying feet, she brushed against Mr. Darling's brand-new trousers, covering them with hair. Oh, what a mistake to have a dog for a nurse, he said angrily. Mrs. Darling brushed away the hairs. Nana is a treasure, she said. I have the feeling she thinks the children are puppies, Mr. Darling said. Mrs. Darling shook her head. No, George, I'm sure she knows they have sores. Mr. Darling rubbed his chin. Well, you may be sure, he said, but I'm not. To quickly change the subject, Mrs. Darling told her husband about the strange ball who had flown in the window. Nonsense, Mr. Darling said. Then let me show you, Mrs. Darling said. She went to the drawer and pulled out the shadow. Mr. Darling sighed, rubbing his chin once more, but this time in earnest. It's nobody I know, he said as he examined the shadow, but he looks like a scoundrel if you ask me. Just then Nana entered up with a bottle of Micah's medicine in her mouth. I don't want to take my medicine, Micah cried. I'll get you some chocolate to make it easier to take, Mrs. Darling said, leaving the room. Don't pamper him, Mr. Darling said to his wife. He turned to Micah. When I was your age, I took my medicine without a sound, he said to his son. I even knew to thank my parents for giving me medicine to make me well. He believed that he was saying, and Wendy believed it too. The medicine you have to take now is worse, isn't it? Wendy asked her father. Much, Mr. Darling said. Why, if I knew where it was, I'd take some to show you how easy it is. Wendy, always eager to help out, said, I know where it is, father. She said. She hurried out the room before Mr. Darling could stop her. Mr. Darling felt in the air, but not in a way that medicine could help. He turned to John and said quietly, My medicine is beastly stuff to take, John. It is the nasty, sticky kind. Wendy returned with Mr. Darling's medicine in a glass. Here it is, she said, handing him to the glass. It will soon be over, father, John said cheerily. Micah has to take his first, Mr. Darling insisted. No, you first, Micah said suspiciously. It will make me sick, Mr. Darling replied. Take it, father, said John. Hold your tongue, Mr. Darling shot back sharply. Wendy was quite puzzled. I thought you said you didn't mind taking your medicine, father, she said. That's not the point, Mr. Darling said. He glanced around for an excuse not to take his medicine. He spied the spoon with Micah's medicine. The point is, I have more medicine in my glass than Micah has in his spoon, he said, and that's not fair. Micah was not persuaded. I'm waiting, he said coldly. That's easy for you to say, Mr. Darling responded. Father's a cowardly custard, Micah said. Well, so are you, Mr. Darling said weakly. I'm not afraid to take my medicine, Micah said. Neither am I, Mr. Darling answered without thinking. Well, take it then, Micah said quickly. Wendy stepped between them. Why don't you both take your medicine at the same time? She suggested. I'll count to 3. It was a splendid idea. All right, Mr. Darling agreed. Are you ready, Micah? Micah nodded. 1, 2, 3. Wendy counted. Micah took his medicine, but Mr. Darling quickly slipped his glass behind his back. Not fair, Micah shouted. Oh, father, Wendy exclaimed. Just as Nana stepped out to the room, Mr. Darling quickly changed the subject. I just thought of a splendid joke, he said with a mischievous grin. I put my medicine into Nana's bowl, and she'll drink it and never know. He poured the murky-looking medicine into the dog's bowl before anyone could say no. What fun, Mr. Darling said. The children eyed their father with scolding looks. They said nothing when Mrs. Darling and Nana returned to the nursery. Mr. Darling patted Nana fondly. Good dog, he said. Here's some milk in your bowl. Nana wagged her fluffy tail as she quickly drank the medicine. The tail suddenly stopped wagging. She turned to Mr. Darling with a sad look. She tucked her tail between her legs and crept to her bed. Mr. Darling was terribly ashamed of what he'd done, but he refused to admit it. Mrs. Darling sniffed the bowl. Oh, George, she said with a reproach, it's your medicine. I was only joking, Mr. Darling said. Wendy went to Nana's side and hugged her. A lot of good is done to be funny around here, Mr. Darling said. After all, who am I except the one who earns the money so we all can live? He realized his argument was lame, but he had no other. He could not afford to look weak in front of his family. You coddle that dog, but you won't let me make a joke. So be it. I will not have that dog ruling my house over another minute. Nana knew instantly what he was saying. The children did too, and they began to cry. Mr. Darling felt strong again. I've made my decision, he said, looking down at Nana. The proper place for you is in the yard, and that's where you're going this instant. Mrs. Darling stepped in and put things right. George, she said in a whisper, I remember what I told you about that boy. Mr. Darling did not listen. He was determined to show one and all who was the master in the family. Come with me, Nana, he said firmly. Nana did not move, so he grabbed her collar and dragged her from the room. He was ashamed of himself, but he could not stop. After he tied Nana in the backyard, Mr. Darling sat alone for a moment. He put his hands to his eyes and rubbed. He was very unhappy with what he had done. In the meantime, Mrs. Darling put the children in bed. They went quickly as Mrs. Darling lit the night lights. The sound of distant barking entered the room. Nana is unhappy because father is chaining her in the yard, John said. Wendy listened closely. That's not her sad bark, she said. That's the bark she gives when she smells danger. Mrs. Darling shivered. Are you sure, Wendy? She said nervously. Oh, yes, Wendy said. Mrs. Darling quivered. She stepped to the window and tested it. It was securely fastened. She looked into the sky. It was filled with stars that seemed to crowd around the house as if they were watching to see what would happen. Mrs. Darling put her hand to her heart. Oh, I wish we weren't going out tonight, she cried. Michael was already half asleep, but he heard his mother's cry. Can anything harm us when the night lights are on? He said quietly. Nothing previous, she said. They are a mother's eye and stay behind to guard you. She went from bed to bed, singing a little song of protection over each child. Michael threw his arms around her. Oh, Mother, he said, I'm so glad to have you. They were the last words she would hear from him for a long, long time. Mr. and Mrs. Darling stepped out of number 14 and carefully made their way down the street. The moment the door to their home closed, something stirred in the dark, starfilled sky. Often Peter liked to dart behind the stars and try to blow them out. But tonight the stars were watching the streets below. They loved fun, and so tonight they were happy to see the grown-ups would not be home. Now, Peter, the smallest star in the Milky Way cried out. Now! Chapter 3. Come away, come away. Shortly after Mr. and Mrs. Darling left the house, the night lights in the nursery went out. In the place was another, much brighter light. It flew about the room, zipping from drawer to closet as if looking for something. It came to rest on the top of something. It came to rest on the top of a dresser. It turned out not to be a light at all, but a tiny fairy no bigger than a fist. She was dressed in an exquisite gown made from a leaf. Her name was Tinker Bell. The children did not see her because they were sound asleep. A moment later, the windows flew open and Peter dropped in. Tink, he called, where are you? He spied her inside a glass jug. Come out of there and tell me where to find my shadow. The sound of tiny bars filled the room. It was fairy talk, and it told Peter his shadow was in the chest of drawers. Peter emptied the drawers one by one until he found his missing shadow. He was so pleased to have his shadow back. He slammed the drawer closed without looking. Tinkerbell was left inside. Peter tried to stick his shadow to his feet, but it would not stick. He wetted it and rubbed it with soap, but the shadow refused to stay put. Peter sat on the floor and began to cry. This woke Wendy. Why are you crying? She said. Peter stood and bowed gracefully the way he had learned from the fairies. Wendy stood up in bed and bowed back. What's your name? Peter asked. Wendy Maria Angela Darling. Wendy replied. What's yours? Peter Pan, Peter said. Where do you live? Wendy asked. Peter glanced out the window, second to the right and then straight on until morning. He said, What a funny address. Wendy said, Is that what they write on your letters? Peter frowned. I don't get letters, he said. Well, is that what they write on your mother's letters? Wendy asked politely. I don't have a mother, Peter said quickly, and I don't care to have one. Wendy went to Peter's side. No wonder you were crying, she said. I wasn't crying about mothers, Peter said indignantly. My shadow won't stay on. How awful, Wendy said as she examined the wrinkled shadow. I shall sew it on. And with the needle and thread, she did just that. The moment the shadow were attached, Peter leaped with joy. How clever I am, he said, forgetting it was Wendy and not he who repaired his shadow. You are very conceited, Wendy said, and cocky too. She was upset. Peter changed his tone. Don't be upset, Wendy, he said sweetly. You are worth 20 boys. Wendy could not resist. Do you really think so, Peter? She asked. Yes, I do, Peter replied. He sat down on the side of the bed next to Wendy. Then I shall give you a kiss, Wendy said. Peter put out his hand to receive the kiss. He did not want to know what a kiss was. Wendy quickly handed him a thimble so his feelings would not be hurt. In return, Peter gave her an acorn button. She accepted it graciously. I shall wear it on a chain around my neck, she said. How fortunate that would be, though just now Wendy could not know why. Wendy was very interested in Peter. How old are you? She asked. Peter squirmed. I don't know, he said. I ran away the day I was born. Why did you do a thing like that? Peter was very uncomfortable. I heard my father and mother talking about what I should be when I grow up, he said at last. Then, looking Wendy straight in the eyes, he said sharply, I don't ever want to be grown up. I want to stay a little boy and have fun. That's why I ran away to live with the fairies. Wendy's fascination grew. She asked dozens of questions about fairies. They seemed quite marvelous because her own life was so ordinary. Peter was surprised because fairies were a nuisance to him, even though he admitted he mostly liked them. Fairies began when the first baby laughed. Peter explained. The laugh broke into thousands of pieces and each became a fairy. Every boy and girl should have one, he added, but they don't believe in fairies. He turned quite serious. Did you know that each time a child says, I don't believe in fairies, a fairy dies? Suddenly Peter remembered Tinker Bell, who had remained very quiet. Tink, he called. Wendy was bird here. There was a fairy in her nursery. Listen, Peter said gleefully. I believe I closed the drawer. The sound of tinkling bells came from the dresser. Peter opened the drawer and Tinker Bell, as angry as a hornet, flew out. She landed on the cuckoo clock. Oh, cried Wendy with delight. She's lovely. I wish she was my fairy. Tinker Bell frowned and spoke rapidly to Peter in the tinkling bell sound that is fairy language. Peter could understand her quite well. What did she say? Wendy asked. She's not very polite, Peter replied. She says you're a big ugly girl, and that she's my fairy. Of course, she can't be mine, because I am a boy and she's a girl. On hearing that, Tinker Bell flew angrily out of the room. Wendy wanted to know more about Peter. When he said he lived in Neverland with the lost boys, she was excited. It must be such fun, she said. But we were lonely. Peter said. There are no girls, you see, only boys who have fallen out of their carriages are sent to Neverland. Girls are much too clever for that. No girls? No girls? Wendy said. John would like that. He really despises girls. On hearing that, Peter kicked John soundly out of bed. That upset Wendy. You may be captain in Neverland, she said, but you're not captain here. She softened her tone, for she knew Peter did not mean to hurt John, who didn't even wake up. Since you meant to be kind, you may give me a kiss. I mean, a thimble, she said, remembering that Peter thought a kiss was a thimble. The moment she leaned forward for the kiss, Tinker Bell flew into the room in a rage. She tugged Wendy's hair soundly. Ouch, Wendy said. Why did she do that? She didn't realize that Tinker Bell was jealous. Peter walked to the window. It's time for me to go, he said. Wendy was very disappointed. She was more disappointed when Peter told her the real reason he had come to the nursery window the first time. It was to hear the wonderful stories your mother tells you, Peter said. Now I must go back to Neverland to tell the boys the story she told about the prince. Oh, don't go, Wendy begged. I know lots of stories. A selfish look crossed Peter's face. He grabbed Wendy by the arm and tugged her towards the window. Come with me and tell the other boys your stories, he said. Wendy held back. I can't, she said. I must think of my mother, and besides, I can't fly. I'll teach you, Peter exclaimed. You could tell us stories and tuck us in at night. Then he smiled in a cunning way. Oh, we would respect you so, he added. You could sew our clothes and make pockets for us. We have none, you see. And you could be a mermaid. Oh, Wendy exclaimed with delight. Can you teach John and Michael to fly too? If you like, he said with a shrug. Wendy shook the boys awake. Wake up, she cried. Peter Pan is going to teach us to fly. Peter took to the air as the darling children watched with awe. It looked very easy. Let me try, John shouted. He leaped into the air but fell down at once. Peter had not told the children one must have fairy dust blown on them first. He liked to tease that way. He quickly blew some fairy dust onto each child. Now wriggle your shoulders like this, Peter said with a wriggle on his shoulder, and let's go. The children did as Peter said and immediately rose into the air. Look at me, each shouted. Look at me. We shall go with you, Wendy called. There will be mermaids, Peter said, and pirates. Pirates, John exclaimed. Then what are we waiting for? Peter soared around the room like a bird, though the children were quite as graceful as that. Nana heard the commotion. She tugged at her chain until it pulled loose. She ran straight to the house where Mr. and Mrs. Darling was attending their party. Something has happened at home, Mrs. Darling exclaimed as Nana bounded into the room. She and Mr. Darling rushed home with Nana on their heel. They ran into the house and raced up the stairs. The children laughed as they soared around the room. Suddenly the bedroom window blew open. A tiny voice from a distant star caught Peter's ear. Beware, the voice said. Peter knew there wasn't a moment to lose. He flew into the night sky. Come with me, he shouted, and John and Michael and Wendy flew out the window to join them. At that moment, Mr. Darling threw open the nursery door, but the room was as empty as a birdcage after all the birds had flown away. Chapter 4. The Flight. Peter told Wendy that the way to Neverland was second to the right and straight on till morning. It wasn't quite that easy. The children followed Peter in his flight, but Peter seemed only to follow his nose and not a map. But they didn't mind. Flying was such fun, it made no difference if they were going somewhere or not. They circled in the air like soaring birds, swooping around church spires, spires, and racing with the clouds. They lost all track of time, and soon they were over the sea. When they were hungry, Peter would snatch a bit of food from a passing bird for them. When they were sleepy, they would far straight towards the sea, only to be saved at the last minute by Peter, who treated the whole thing as a game. He loved to show off by sleeping on his back or by teasing sharks in the water below. Tell him to stop showing off, John said jealously. We must be nice to him, Wendy answered. If he left us, where would we be? We could go home, Michael said. Wendy flew alongside her little brother. But we don't know the way, she said. We must be polite to him. Peter had flown off for a moment, and the children felt quite lonely. They were sure he had forgotten them. He forgets things he did only moments ago. And he said he might forget us too. The sun was high in the sky, and the sea below was calm when Peter pulled alongside the children. There it is, he said. Neverland. Wendy, John, and Michael looked into the distance. Looked into the distance. Where? They shouted. They craned their necks for a better look, and suddenly they saw it. All at once, they knew it. An instant it was Neverland. There's the lagoon, Wendy said as she pointed to the island in the sea. And there's your cave, Michael, John said with glee. I see smokes from the Indian camp, Michael said. It's just across the mysterious river. In the children's dream, Neverland was make-believe. Now it was real. Peter was annoyed that the children already knew so much about Neverland. He wanted to be their leader. He sent Tinkerbell on ahead to scout the island. It was growing dark as the children and Peter swooped low over the island. Wendy, John, and Michael stayed close to him. Peter studied the island closely. Would you like an adventure now? He asked. Or would you rather have tea first? Tea, Wendy said quickly. Michael agreed, but John was more interested in adventure. What kind of adventure? He said cautiously. There's a pirate asleep in the plain just below us, Peter said. If you like, we can go down and fight him. John looked for the pirate. I don't see him, he said. Well, I do, Peter answered sharply. What if he wakes up? John asked nervously. You don't think I would attack him while he's sleeping, Peter said indignantly. I would wake him first. Now John was unsure if he wanted to attack or have tea first. How many pirates are there? He said. More than I can count, Peter said. Their leader is Captain Hook. John gulped aloud, and Michael began to cry. They already knew of Captain Hook's fierce reputation. He's big, Peter said quickly, but not as big as he was. I cut off a bit. You did? John asked, astonished. His right hand, Peter replied proudly. Now he has an iron hook for a hand that is quite like a claw. A claw? John gulped again. But he can start a fight, Peter said. So you must promise that if we meet him in a fight, you must leave him to me. I promise, John said, relieved. It grew darker. When Tinkerbell returned, the children could see one another in her glow and felt less afraid. Tink whirled around them like a moth around a candle, though she was the light. Peter didn't like things lighting up everything just then. Tink says the pirates spotted us, he said. They saw her light and got out their cannons. Long time. Then tell her to go away, the children cried. No, Peter said. She thinks we're lost, and she's afraid. Then tell her to turn off her light, Wendy begged. Fairies can't turn off their lights, Peter said. The lights only go off when they are asleep. When they can go asleep when they're tired. He glanced at the children. If one of us had a pocket, we could carry her in it, he said. He thought for a moment. I have it. John had carried her in his hat. Tink agreed to hide in the hat, though not if Wendy carried it. She jumped in and John put it on his head. Immediately the children were surrounded by darkness. They flew on in silence, though many noises reached them from the island below. Suddenly the air was rocked by a powerful roar of the pirates' fire Long Tom. There was no longer any doubt that the island was real. Peter was tossed high into the air and put out sight by a rush of wind. Wendy and Tinkerbell, who was still in John's hat, were blown into another direction. John and Michael floated around in the darkness. Are you shot? John whispered to his brother. I don't know, Michael whispered back. Luckily nobody was hit by the cannonball. Tinkerbell popped out of John's hat to find herself alone with Wendy. This was the perfect time for her to get rid of Wendy, for Tink was very jealous of her. She flitted back and forth in front of Wendy, filling the air with the tinkling sound of her voice. Wendy couldn't understand her, of course, but thought it meant, follow me. Wendy didn't know what to do. She called for John and Michael and Peter, but nobody answered. Since Wendy didn't know that Tink didn't like her, she trusted the tiny fairy and followed. She didn't know she was flying to her own doom. Chapter 5. The Island Comes True. Neverland came back to life now that Peter was almost there. When he was gone, everybody did nothing but wait for him to return. Now things would be back to normal. The Lost Boys looked for Peter, their leader. The pirates looked for the Lost Boys. The Indians looked for the pirates. And the beasts looked for the Indians. Each was out to get the other in a long parade that circled the island. The 6 Lost Boys, dressed in the bearskins and with their hands upon the daggers, crept through the sugar cane in single file. Toothless, a kind and trusting lad, was in the lead. He was just the one for Tinkerbell's plan of mischief. Next was Nibs, and then came Slightly, who liked to dance to music he played on a whistle. Curly, who always took the blame for things, was followed by the twins. Nobody is quite sure which is which. The sounds of a song entered the thicket as the boys vanished into the gloom. It was the pirates' dreadful song. Avast belay, yo-ho, heave to, a-pirating we go. And if we're parted by a chute, we're sure to meet below. The pirates was a villainous group. Seko was in the lead. Behind him was a black man with many names, and after him tattooed Barrie. Then came Gentleman Starkey, Skylights, and Smee. Though a pirate, Smee was anything but fierce. The others considered him pathetic, mainly because his sense of fair play was alarming. For a pirate in the midst of them and the rest of the crew was the most villainous one of all. The sworn enemy of Peter Pan, Captain Hook, trailing the pirates, were the Indians carrying tomahawks and knives. In the lead was Great Big Little Panther, his beard filled with many scalps. Bringing up the rear were the danger was greatest was Tiger Lily, the proud and beautiful Indian princess. The Indians disappeared like shadows without making a sound. Behind the Indians came the man-eating lions and tigers and bears with their tongues hanging out. They also vanished in the gloom. And last of all, in the parade that nobody could see all at once, was a gigantic crocodile. It was hungry, too, but the meal it had in mid was quite special. The boys grew tired and stopped to rest not far from their underground home. I wish Peter would come back, Toothless said. Maybe he can tell us more about Cinderella. Toothless believed his mother was like Cinderella. The only time the boys could talk about mothers was when Peter was away. Peter hated talk of mothers. Toothless stopped at the sound of far-off singing. It was the grim song they knew too well. Yo ho ho, the pirate's life, the flag of skull and bones, a merry hour, a hempen rope, and hey for Davy Jones. Before the song died away, the boys vanished into their underground homes faster than rabbits down their holes. The entrances were 7 hollow trees known only to the boys. Hook had searched for the underground home for many moons, and so far had not found it. But this time Nips was low in hiding. The pirates entered the clearing just as he disappeared into the trees. Starkey spied him. He pulled out his pistol to fire, but Hook's iron claw grabbed his shoulder. "Put away that pistol," Hook bellowed. "But it was one of those boys you hate," Starkey said. "You could have shot him easily and bring those Indians down on us," Hook said, looking over his shoulder. "Do you want to lose your scalp?" Hook rubbed his chin with his good hand. "Besides," he continued, "that was only one. I want R7. He pointed to the woods with his hook. "Now find them." The pirates scurried into the woods, leaving only Smee and Captain Hook behind. Hook followed them with his eyes. "Most of all, I want their leader, Peter Pan," he said to Smee. "He's the one who cut off my hand." He raised his hook threateningly. "I want to shake his hand with this," he growled, slicing the air with his shiny metal claw. He frowned. "Peter threw my arm into a passing crocodile," he said with a painful wince. "I've often wondered about your fear of crocodiles," Smee said. Hook glared at him. "Not crocodiles," he said, "just the one that ate my hand. Ever since, hoping he liked it so much he began following me ever since, hoping to dine on the other." He glared at Smee. "That's why I want Peter Pan." Hook sat down on a large mushroom with a nervous laugh. "That crocodile have had me by now if he hadn't accidentally swallowed a clock," he said. "Now when I hear that clock inside him ticking, I run before he can get me." "What will happen when the clock runs down?" Smee asked. "That's what haunts me," Hook said fearfully. Suddenly he jumped up. He put his hand on the mushroom he'd been sitting on. "This seed is hot," he said. 2 pirates studied the strange mushroom and then pulled it out of the ground. Smoke poured from the hole where the mushrooms had been. "Odds bobs, hammers and tongues, I'm burning," Hook exclaimed. The pirates looked at each other. "A chimney!" they cried. They dropped to their knees. Voices rose up the chimney along with the smoke. It was the lost boy speaking with fear and safety of their underground home. Hook glanced around. He saw the 7 trees with entrance doors. His mouth curled into a sinister smile. He tapped his nose with his hook. "Did you hear them, Smee?" he whispered. "They said Peter is not home." His smile twisted more sharply than ever. "It's time to begin my plan," he hissed. "We'll return to the ship, where I'll bake a thick cake covered with green sugar. I'll put it on the shore of the mermaids' lagoon. The boys will find it when they go there to swim and play with the mermaids. They'll eat the cake because they have no mother to tell them this dangerous to eat fish cake. And then," he stopped to savor what would happen next, "and then they will die. Wonderful!" Hook chortled. chortled. It is a perfect plan. Hook leaped into the air with glee. He opened his mouth to sing, but stopped before he could utter a note. Another sound froze him in place. It was a steady tick, tick, tick that grew closer with each tick. The crocodile! Hook screamed just before he disappeared into the woods with a terrified Smee right behind. The crocodile slithered through the clearing with a strange smile on its face, but did not stop. It stayed on Hook's tail no matter where it led. The boys emerged into the open as Nibs raced towards them, persuaded by the pack of wolves. "Save me!" Nibs screamed as he fell to the ground. "What can we do without Peter?" one of the boys asked. "Do what Peter would do," shouted another. "Look at the wolves through your legs." The boys bent over and looked through their legs at the wolf pack. In an instant the wolves turned and fled. Nibs got to his feet. He looked at his companions with wide eyes. "I've seen a wonderful thing," he said in a voice filled with awe. "It was the great white bird, and it's coming here." He pointed into the air. "See?" As he spoke, a figure high in the sky descended towards the group of lost boys. Soon it was directly overhead. It was Wendy, crying because she was lost. "Poor Wendy," she cried sadly. "Poor Wendy." It's a Wendy bird," Curly said. "There are such things, you know." When Wendy was very close, the boys heard another voice. It was Tinkerbell. Like Peter, they could understand her quite well. The jealous little fairy called to the boys. "Shoot the Wendy," Tinkerbell said. "Peter wants you to shoot the Wendy." The boys always obeyed Peter. "Quick, get bows and arrows," one shouted. The boys popped down their tree horse. Toothless stayed behind because he already had his bow and arrows. "Quick!" Tinkerbell cried. "Shoot her now!" Toothless loaded his bow. "Peter will be so pleased," he said. He fired. Before he could blink, Wendy fluttered to the ground with an arrow in her breast. Chapter 6. The Little House. Toothless stood over Wendy's body like a proud hunter as the other boys popped out of their tree horse. "You're too late," he said, beaming. "I shot the Wendy. Peter will be so pleased." Tinkerbell tinkered a little laugh and flew away to hide. The boys silently gathered around Wendy. "This isn't a bird," Slightly said. "I think it's a lady." "A lady?" Toothless gasped. "We have killed her," Nib said, taking off his cap. The others did the same. "I think I understand," Curly said. "Peter was bringing a lady to take care of us." Toothless backed away. "I did it," he said. "I used to dream a pretty mother would come to me, but now when she did, I shot her." "Don't go," the others called. "I have to," Toothless said. "I'm afraid of what Peter will say." At that very moment, Peter's car rang through the woods. "It's Peter!" the boys cried out. They formed a circle around Wendy's body. "We must hide her," they whispered, but before they could move, Peter dropped in front of them. "Greetings, boys," he exclaimed. The boys saluted mechanically, but said nothing. "Well, I'm back," Peter said. "Why aren't you cheering?" The boys opened their mouths, but no sound came out. "Never mind," Peter said excitedly. "I have great news. I have brought back a mother for you at last. Have you seen her? She was flying this way." Toothless dropped to his knees. "She's here, Peter," he said sadly. He motioned to the boys to back away. Peter stared at Wendy's body. He didn't know what to do. "She's dead," Toothless said. Peter took his arrow from Wendy's breast. "Whose arrow is this?" he demanded sternly. "Mine, Peter," said Toothless. Peter raised the arrow like a dagger. Toothless didn't flinch. He opened his shirt. "Strike me, Peter," he said. Peter's arm would not move. "I can't strike," he said. "Something is holding me back." While the other boys stared at Peter, Nibs glanced at Wendy. She moved!" he cried. "The Wendy lady moved!" Wendy had raised her arm. Nibs fell to his knees by her side and listened. She said, "Poor Toothless." He exclaimed, "She's alive!" Peter shouted. He kneeled at Wendy's side. He spied the acorn button she had given her. It was on a chain around her neck. The button was against her breast. He held up the arrow. The arrow struck the button. "Struck the button," he said. "It saved her life." The tinkle of a tiny bell echoed through the woods. "It's Tink," Lee said. "She's unhappy because Wendy is still alive." The boys told Peter what Tink had done. Peter was angrier than they had ever seen. "I'm not your friend anymore," Peter called to Tinker Bell. "Be gone from me forever." Tinker Bell flew to Peter and circled his shoulders. She pleaded not to be sent away. When Peter saw Wendy raise her arm, he changed his mind. "Well, not forever," he said to Tink with a scowl, "but for one whole week." Then he turned his attention back to Wendy. "What should we do with her?" one boy asked. "Let's carry her into our house," Clay suggested. "She's too delicate," Peter said. "We must not touch her." The others agreed. "But if she lies here, she will die," Toothless said. "I have an idea," Peter said. "We'll build a house around her." The boys immediately set to work. In no time, they were as busy as tailors before the wedding, gathering wood and furniture and bedding. Just then John and Michael appeared. They were exhausted and almost fell asleep standing up. They were relieved to find Peter, even though he was too busy with Wendy's house to talk to them. "Is Wendy sleeping?" John asked. "Yes," Peter said sharply. "We are her servants. Now help us build her house." The boys protested because Wendy was a girl, but they soon gave in. Peter thought of everything. "Fetch a doctor," he told slightly walked away, puzzled. But soon returned with John's hat on his head and a solemn look on his face. "Are you the doctor?" Peter asked. "Yes," Slightly replied. He knew it was make-believe, even though Peter didn't. When the boys disagreed, Peter rapped their knuckle. Slightly kneeled at Wendy's side. He put a make-believe thermometer in her mouth and then pretended to look at it after he removed it. "How is she?" Peter asked anxiously. "This has cured her," Slightly asked. "I'm glad," Peter cried. "I will make another visit this evening," Slightly said. "In the meantime, give her a cup of beef tea." He took off John's hat when Peter wasn't looking. In the meantime, the other boys had been busy. Everything was ready to build Wendy's house. "I wish we knew what kind of house she would like best," a boy said. Hearing that, Wendy began to sing. "I wish I had a pretty house the littlest ever seen, with funny little red walls and roof of mossy green." The boys were delighted, for that is exactly what they were building. The branches they gathered was covered with red sap, and they had lots of moss for a roof. Soon the house was finished. It was quite beautiful, with Wendy resting comfortably inside. Peter walked around the house, ordering finishing touches. "There's no door knocker," he said. Toothless hung the soles of his shoe on the door. "There's no chimney," Peter said. He punched the top out of John's hat and put it on the roof. Smoke immediately rose through it. There was nothing left to do but knock on the door. The boys straightened themselves as Peter politely knocked. Tink, perched on the tree branch, sneered at them. The door opened and Wendy stepped out. "Where am I?" she asked. The boys whipped off their hats. "You're in the house we have built for you," Slightly said. "We hope you are pleased." "It is a lovely little house," Wendy said happily. "We are your children," the twins exclaimed. With that, all the boys fell to their knees. "Oh, Wendy, lady, be our mother," they pleaded. "Should I?" Wendy asked, beaming. "I'm only a little girl." "That doesn't matter," Peter said. "What we need is a nice, motherly person." "Oh dear," Wendy said. "That is just what I believe I am." "You are," the boys cried. "We knew it at once." "Very well," Wendy said. "Then I shall do my best." She looked at the boys gathered around her. "Now, come inside and at once. Your feet are damp, so I shall have to put you to bed. But first, I will finish the story of Cinderella." The boys crowded into the tiny house with glee. Soon they were all tucked in bed and fast asleep. Wendy slept too, but Peter stayed outside with his sword drawn to protect the little house against pirates and wolves. That was the first of many joyous evenings the lost boys spent with Wendy. Chapter 7. The Mermaid Lagoon. The next day, Peter measured hollow trees for Wendy, John, and Michael. They would need their own trees to enter and leave the underground home. Soon they were able to go up and down like buckets in a well. The underground home was a marvelous place. It was one giant room. During the day, the floor was anything you wanted to make it. The lost boys and Michael and John used it for play. There was mushrooms to sit on it and a crackling fire. And if you wanted, you could dig a hole in the floor and go fishing. Wendy was much too busy, of course, because she was a mother and did not have time for such things. She had to cook and clean, and at night she mended everyone's socks. There was just one bed for the boys, who slept side by side like sardines in a can. Michael slept in a hanging basket because he was the baby. Tinkerbell lived in a little room of her own that she closed at night with a curtain. As time passed, Wendy and her brothers thought less and less about their mother and father. Sometimes Michael believed Wendy was his real mother. Wendy was not too concerned, but because she was sure their parents had left a window open so she and John and Michael could fly home when the time came. In the meantime, there were adventures to be had. Adventures was what Wendy Neverland was all about. It was Indians and lions and tigers and bears and pirates and mermaids and much more. The difficulty was which adventure to choose. The adventure that usually took place in the Mermaid's Lagoon. The lagoon is a lovely place of many colors where mermaids sing and play and bask on a rock in the sun. The children spent many long summer days on the lagoon, swimming and floating and playing with a mermaid. Wendy enjoyed sitting on a rock watching them as she stitched to pass the time. Sometimes the mermaids deliberately splashed water on her because they didn't really like her very much. They treated the boys the same way, though they got along well with Peter. On sunny days after the rain, dozens of mermaids came to the surface of the lagoon to play with their puppers. They hit them back and forth with their tails, trying to keep them in the rainbow until they burst. If the children tried to join them, the mermaids quickly disappeared beneath the water. One sunny day, the boys were dozing on Mariner's Rock. Wendy stitched as she watched over them like a mother. Suddenly a strange shadow came over the lagoon. The air turned from warm to cold. The lagoon was no longer a friendly place, but instead was filled with danger. Wendy knew the story of Mariner's Rock. It was named by evil captains who abandoned sailors there. They would drown when the rising tide covered them. Wendy shivered. She thought to wake the children, but thought again and let them sleep. She did not want to interrupt their nap. The sound of muffled rowing reached her ears. Peter heard it too and woke up as fast as a sleeping dog that smelled danger. He put his hand over his ear and listened. "Pirates!" he cried. The sleeping boy woke with a start. "Dive!" Peter shouted. Wendy and the boys obeyed at once. They tumbled into the water like fish pouring from a barrel. In a moment, Mariner's Rock was as bare as a stone in the midst of a calm green sea. The pirates' dinghy approached the rock with Smee and Starkey pulling the oars. The back was the Indian pirate princess. In back was the Indian princess, Tiger Lily. She was bound hand and foot. Though she knew her fate, her face was calm. She knew she would be left on the rock to perish. She had been captured trying to board Hook's pirate ship with a knife in her mouth. Now she would die a death unfit for a daughter of an Indian chief. Smee and Starkey did not see the rock in the gloom until the small boat crashed headlong into it. It took less than a minute to put their captive on the barren rock because her pride would not let her resist. Nearby, but out of sight, Peter and Wendy watched in horror, their heads bobbing silently in the water. Wendy began to cry because she had never seen a tragedy. Peter was angry because there was 2 pirates against 1 princess. He decided to save Tiger Lily. It would be too easy to wait for the pirates to leave. He had another plan. "Ahoy there, you lovers," he called, imitating Captain Hook's gruff voice. "It's our captain," Smee said with surprise. "He's swimming to meet us." Starkey said. "We are putting Tiger Lily on the rocks," Smee cried out. "Set her free," Peter shouted, started using the pirate captain's voice. "Cut her bonds at once." The pirates shuddered. They dared not disobey. They knew the punishment they would get if they did. "Aye, aye, Captain," Smee said, quickly cutting Tiger Lily's bonds. She slipped straight into the water like an eel. Wendy was delighted with Peter's cleverness. Before he could say a word, Hook's voice boomed again over the water. But this time it was not Peter. It was Hook himself. He was swimming towards the pirates' dinghy. As he climbed aboard, the glow of the pirate's lantern lit his face. Wendy shuddered at the sight of his evil face. Hook seated himself at the back of the tiny craft with a heavy sigh. "Is something wrong, Captain?" Smee asked. "The game is up," Hook groaned. "The lost boys have found their mother." The pirates groaned too. "Oh, evil day," Starkey moaned. Wendy was filled with pride. She knew the pirates meant her. "What's the mother?" Smee asked. "He doesn't know," Wendy gasped. At once she knew that Simba Smee would be her favorite pirate, if ever there could be such a thing. Peter quietly pulled her under the water before she could say more. "What was that?" Hook bellowed. He held a lantern to light the dark waters around about. The dim beam caught the strange sight. Another bird floated by, sitting on its nest. "That is a mother!" Hook exclaimed. "You see, its nest fell into the water, but she would not think to abandon her eggs." There was an odd catch in Hook's voice, as if some memories of his own struggled to reach the surface. He brushed it away with a sweep of his iron hook. Smee gazed at the drifting bird on her nest as it passed by. "I have an idea, Captain," he said eagerly. "You can kidnap the boys' mothers and make her our mother." "A splendid idea," Hook replied. He began to think. He rubbed his long chin with his hook. "We will seize the children and carry them to our boat. I will make the boys walk the plank, and she shall be our mother." When he had bobbed to the surface, when she heard Hook's evil plan, she gasped. "Never!" she cried. Luckily, the pirates did not see or hear her. The pirates swore to carry out Hook's dreadful plan. Then, as if remembering something, Hook looked around the boat. "Where is Tiger Lily?" he roared. "We let her go, Captain," Smee asked. "It was your orders." "Let her go?" Hook cried. "I have no such order," he said with a shiver in his voice. He looked into the gloomy lagoon. "There are spirits that haunt this place," he whispered. At the word spirits, Smee and Starkey wrapped their arms around one another in fear. Hook put his good hand to his mouth. I know you're there, spirits, he said. Do you hear me? Who are you? Hook called out. I'm Captain Hook, the captain of Jolly Roger, Peter said. Hook shook his head in disbelief. But I'm Captain Hook, he said. No, Peter said it with a grin. I am Hook, and you're a codfish. Smee and Starkey glanced at one another. Could it be they were commanded by a codfish, they wondered. Hook worried that he would lose his authority over his men. He shouted into the darkness again. Do you have another name? He asked, hoping to trick the strange voice into revealing his identity. Yes, Peter said, but you must guess it. The pirates put their heads together, but came up with nothing. We give up, Hook shouted. I am Peter Pan, Peter shouted gleefully. Now we have him, Hook said, once more in full command of his men. After him, men, he ordered. The pirates drew their swords. Peter cupped his hands to his mouth. Come fight them, boys, he called, and from the other lagoon came the voices of the boys, each saying, Aye, aye. The pirates and boys met in a fierce battle. John was in the midst of the brandishing and cutlass he tore from a pirate's grasp. The battle was short. Hook held off the circle of attacking boys with his glistening iron hook. They backed away, fearing for their lives. The dinghy drifted away. Peter was not afraid to meet Hook. He climbed atop the rock, and Hook joined him from the opposite side. Peter snatched a knife from Hook's belt. He was ready to use it when he saw that he was higher on the rock than Hook. Since that made an unfair fight, Peter put out his hand to help Hook to the top. At that moment, Hook struck. He clawed Peter twice with his hook. Peter first, stunned by the blows, but even more so by Hook's dishonesty. Hook leaped into the water with the other pirates. They swam for their lives in the direction of Jolly Roger. Right behind them was a crocodile gnashing his silvery sharp teeth. The boys looked everywhere for Peter and Wendy, but both had vanished. They got into the pirates' dinghy and rowed towards home. Their shouts of Peter, Wendy went unanswered, except for the mocking laughter of the mermaids. The boys weren't too worried. They were sure Peter and Wendy were swimming or flying home. They hurried so they wouldn't be late for bed. Soon after the dinghy was gone, two feeble cries drifted over the lagoon. Help! Help! Peter and Wendy lay on top of the rock. Peter was wounded, and Wendy was tired and weak. A mermaid tried to pull Wendy into the water, but Peter pulled her back to safety. We have to get off the rock, Peter said. The tide is rising. Soon we will be covered. I am too tired to swim or to fly, Wendy said weakly. And I don't have the strength to carry both of us, Peter moaned. Then we will drown, Wendy said. They put their hands over their eyes to shut out the horrible thoughts. Something touched Peter's cheek. He opened his eyes. A night kite hovered over the rock. Its long tail had brushed Peter's face. Michael's kite, Peter exclaimed. He lost it the other day. But here it is. He pulled the night kite towards him. We shall use it to carry us home. Wendy shook her head sadly. It can't carry two, she said. Michael and Curly are already tried. Then it will take you to safety, Peter said. He tied Wendy to the kite and pushed her off the rocks. She was pulled into the air and was soon out of sight. Peter was alone. The rising water tapped at his toes, ready to calm him. Far off, the mermaids sang their doleful song to the moon. Peter stood. He was afraid. Then a faint smile crossed his lips, and he heard a drum beating within him. It was saying, to die will be an awfully big adventure. Chapter 8. Happy Home. Peter was quite alone. The mermaids had all gone to their beds beneath the sea. The only sound was the steady splash of water rising against the rock. Then a glimmer of sound something floating on the water caught Peter's eyes. It looked like a bit of paper, but a closer look revealed it was another bird on her drifting nest. The bird was struggling to reach Peter. She flapped her wings in the water like oars. She was nearly exhausted by the effort. It was her intention to give Peter her nest as a raft, but of course she could not tell him that. And of course he could not ask what her intentions were. Neither spoke the other's language. The never bird cackled at Peter in bird language, and Peter called back in his. They grew angry because each thought the other was really trying to understand. Not really trying to understand. "Why don't you do as I tell you?" the never bird asked, and Peter replied, "What are you quacking about?" It seemed hopeless. The never bird had an idea. She decided to show Peter what she wanted. She flapped her wings and rose into the air, abandoning her nest and its cargo of precious eggs. At once, Peter understood the bird was giving up her nest so he could have a raft. But eggs in the nests were a problem. He could not simply throw them out. Luckily, Peter spied Starkey's hat nearby on the rock. Peter placed the big eggs in the hat and set it on the water. It floated as well as a boat. The bird was delighted. She fluttered to the hat and sat on the eggs while Peter paddled the nest safely to shore. In no time at all, Peter was in home under the ground. Wendy was already there. The kite had carried her straight home. The boys were thrilled to see Peter and Wendy, but they were more excited to stay up past their bedtime. Wendy would have none of that. To bed, she said firmly. It was a voice that boys simply had to obey. When the Indians learned that Peter had saved Tiger Lily, they became his devoted friends. They called him Chief and swore to do anything for him. The Indian braves stood watch over the underground homes to protect Peter and the others from the pirate attack. Everyone knew the pirates would attack, but they did not know when. Peter liked being admired by the Indians and let their praise go to his head. "Your chief is glad to see such brave warriors protecting his wigwam," he would say. On the other hand, the Indians were not so respectful to the boys. That was fine by Peter, who thought that was as it should be. Wendy secretly sympathized with the boys, but she said nothing because she did not want to upset Peter, who everyone pretended was their father. "Father knows best," she said, though she did not always believe it. One night, Peter left the underground home to check the time. The only clock on the island was inside the crocodile, so all he had to do was find the creature and wait for the chime. But the Indians were at their posts above the house, while inside, the children were eating supper. It was make-believe, of course, like the rest of the adventure. The boys broke into a squabble, and Wendy had to silence them with a sharp silence. When Peter came home, he found them full of complaints. John had wanted to sit in Peter's chair. The twins complained to John. Toothless wanted to pretend he was the father, or if not, he would be the baby, but Micro would not let him. Slightly coughed at the table. And Curly ate both butter and honey. "And we want you to dance," the twins said. At first, Peter refused, but since he was the best dancer, he finally gave in. Soon they were all dancing. Nobody knew what was to happen before the night was out. Perhaps it was best not to know. The dance soon turned into an uproarious pillow fight atop the bed, but even that ended, because it was soon time for bed. The children quieted down as Wendy prepared to tell a good night story. Usually, Peter put his hands over his ears and left the room when Wendy told this particular story, but tonight he stayed on his store to listen. Once upon a time, there was a gentleman with a lady, Wendy began, but before she could continue, the voice interrupted. Was a lady, cried one of the twins. Do you mean she is dead? I wish the gentleman was a white rat, Nib said. Be quiet, Wendy scolded. No, the lady is not dead, she said, getting back to her story. I'm glad, Toothless said. Shh, Peter hushed, as a little less noise. The gentleman's name was Mr. Darling, Wendy said. The lady's name was Mrs. Darling. I knew them once, John said, to annoy the others. I think I knew them too, Micah said, though he was not so sure. Wendy ignored the interruptions. The lady and gentleman were married, she said, and they had 3 descendants. Descendants only mean children, John said. Wendy touched her finger to her lips before continuing. The 3 children had a faithful nurse called Nana, she said, but one night Mr. Darling chained her in the yard because he was angry with her. She glanced at the boys and Peter, who listened wide-eyed. That night the children flew away to Neverland, where the lost children are, Wendy went on, and their star. Was one of the lost children called Toothless? Toothless asked excitedly. Wendy nodded. Hooray! Toothless crowed. I am in a story. Shh, Wendy hushed. Just think of those unhappy parents with all their children flown away, everyone moaned, though they really weren't much interested in unhappy parents at all. How can the story have a happy ending? A twin asked. If you knew how much a mother loves her children, you would know, Wendy said. Peter didn't like this part of the story, but Wendy continued to tell the rest. The oldest child knew that a mother would leave the window open, she said. That way the children could return whenever they wanted. Did they go back? Toothless asked, and he tapped the side of her nose. We have to look into the future to see, she said with her eyes looking off. Many years later, an elegant woman steps off a train. My goodness, it is Wendy, she says with a smile, and with her are 2 handsome gentlemen. Why, they're John and Michael. Oh, John and Michael gasped to hear they were in the story. The 3 are in front of the house, Wendy said. Now Wendy points to the open window. There is our reward for trusting our mother's love, she says. Wendy turned to the boys, and that is the happy ending. Oh, I am Peter groaned. Wendy ran to him at once. Where does it hurt? She asked. He put his hand over his heart. Here, he said, but he wasn't really ill, of course. It was a story that hurt him. You're wrong about mothers, Wendy, he said. I used to think my mother would keep a window open for me too, but when I went back, the window was buried. She had forgotten all about me. The idea of being forgotten frightened John and Micah. Let's go home, Wendy, they cried. Wendy gathered them in her arms. Yes, she said, tonight. Not tonight, the lost voice cried in bewilderment. We'll leave at once, Wendy said. The thought had suddenly occurred to her that her mother's heart was half broken with her children gone. Peter, she said quickly, will you make the necessary arrangements? If you wish, Peter said calmly, trying to keep his real feelings hidden. He hurried up the hollow tree to tell the Indians what to do. When he returned to the home under the ground, the lost voice had rebelled. It will be worse for us than before she came, they shouted, frightened by the thought of losing Wendy. We shall keep her prisoner. But Toothless should have none of it. Don't touch her, he cried. The other boys withdrew. Just then Peter stepped into the room. We won't keep you against your war, he said. The Indians will guide you through the woods, and Tinkerbar will lead you across the sea. Tinkerbar was delighted that Wendy would be leaving, but she was not eager to be Wendy's guide. Peter gave her a warning stare, and she quickly changed her mind. John and Michael prepared for the journey as the lost boys watched dejectedly. Wendy's heart melted at the sight of the sad lost boys. You can come with us, she said. I'm sure my father and mother will adopt you. Can we go, Peter? The boys shouted excitedly. Peter nodded that they could, though his heart was not in it. The boys rushed out to get their things. And you'll come too, Wendy said to Peter. No, Peter said calmly. I am not going. But it's to find your mother, Wendy said. No, Peter said. I don't need a mother. And besides, I want to stay a little boy and have fun. The lost boys returned, each with a bundle of the end of a stick. When they heard Peter wasn't coming, they were stunned. But that was that. So Wendy gathered everyone for the journey. Remember to change your flannels and take your medicine, she said to Peter. I will, Peter said, trying to hide his real feelings. He turned to Tinkerbell. Lead the way for them, he said. Tink immediately darted up the nearest hollow tree. But nobody followed, because at the very moment the room was filled with the sound of clinking steel and rough voices, and the pirates had attacked. Chapter 9. The children are carried off. The attack came as a complete surprise. The pirates had sneaked quietly through the forest until they were close to the home beneath the ground. There they waited for dawn. Hook had learned this tactic from the Indians. The Indians guarded the secret lair near the pirates were on the island. Of course, they did not expect an attack before dawn. They sat quietly with blankets wrapped around them, unaware that Hook and his evil band was so near. The pirates swooped into the Indian camp just before daylight. An alert scattered a coyote cry as a warning. But it was too late. When the stunned Indians saw the pirates, they leaped to their feet. A dozen braves circled Tiger Lily to protect her. Others ran to meet the cutlass-wielding pirates. The air filled with war cries, the rang of cold steel against iron tomahawks, and the shouts of fallen men. It was a gruesome battle in which many perished on both sides. But the pirates did not let up their attack. Soon the small circle of Indians protecting Tiger Lily was all that remained of the tribe, fighting for their lives. The Indians cut their ways through the ring of pirates and escaped. Hook was elated, but he was not satisfied. It was Peter Pan he was after. The pirate despised Peter. True, Peter had thrown Hook's hand to the crocodile, which was reason enough to dislike someone, but Hook hatred went beyond that. It wasn't Peter's good looks or courage that drove Hook crazy. It was Peter's utter cockiness. Hook vowed to smash the bothersome boy like a mosquito. Hook studied the hollow trees leading to the underground home. The openings were too narrow for fat pirates. He looked over his motherly band for someone who could wiggle his way into the cavern below. In the meantime, the children had heard the sound of battle over their heads. They listened, frozen with fear, the whoops of men and the clang of steel. Now it was silent. Wendy, John, Michael, Peter, and the lost boy stared at one another. The same question was on everyone's lips. Which side won? Peter gazed upwards, with a hand cupped to his ears. If the Indians have won, they will beat their tom-tom as a sign of victory, he said. The others cupped their ears to listen. A pirate near a hollow tree heard what Peter said and reported it to Hook. Hook grinned a devilish smile. He turned to Smee. Beat the drum, he said. Smee chuckled at his captain's devious plan. He beat the drum in the Indian manner. Listen, Peter exclaimed when he heard the victory tom-tom. The Indians have won. We can leave after all, Wendy said. The children had said goodbye to Peter and made ready to hurry up the hollow trees for their journey home. But the pirates had other plans. They smirked and rubbed their hands as they waited for the children to pop out of the hollow trees. Curly was the first one out. He fell into the hands of a pirate who quickly passed him on to another. One by one stepped out of the opening of the hollow trees. Wendy was last. Hook removed his hat and bowed graciously when he saw Wendy. He personally escorted her to where the boys were being tightly bound with stout ropes so they could not escape. Wendy was surprised by Hook's unusual politeness and did not cry out even when she, too, was tied. Hook watched with pleasure as his men tied up the children. As Lightly was being tied, the sinister captain noticed something about the boy that nobody else had seen. Slightly's belly was swollen around from the habit of drinking too much water. This could mean only one thing. The opening in Slightly's hollow tree had a large enough for a man to slip through. If so, Hook could let himself into the home under the ground. Meanwhile, unaware of the battle above, Peter House continued for a time to play on his pipes. When he lay down on his bed and fell asleep, the pirates carried the children off to their ship. Hook tiptoed to Slightly's hollow tree and slithered down the hole like a snake. He stood behind the door at the bottom and listened. The cavernous room was silent. Hook peered through a crack in the door. He whipped his smirking lips with the back of his hand. Across the room, lying back asleep, were Peter. His medicine bottle was on a table next to the bed. Medicine had not been touched. Hook knew at once how he would get rid of Peter forever. Hook carried a bottle of powerful poison with him at all times. It was a vile yellow substance he had concocted himself. He slipped the bottle from his stash and poured 5 potent drops into Peter's medicine cup. Hook knew that the moment Peter took his medicine, he would be rid of the boy forever. Satisfied that the deed was done, Hook slipped back up the hollow tree and disappeared into the forest. Later, a soft tapping on the door woke Peter from the sleep. The sound of tinkling bells filled the air. Peter smiled. It was Tink. He quietly opened the door. The tiny fairy burst into the room. Peter saw at once that she was upset. "What's the matter, Tink?" he asked. Tinkerbell told Peter how the pirates had captured Wendy and the boys and how they were at the moment prisoners on the pirate ship. "I'll rescue her," Peter shouted. He hurried to get his weapons. He stopped suddenly as he passed the table with his medicine cup. "I did not take my medicine because I wanted to displease Wendy," he said. "Now I shall take it to show that I care." He lifted the cup to his lips. "No!" Tinkerbell shrieked. She had heard Hook as he raced through the forest, boasting aloud about how he had done. She knew the cup contained deadly poison. "It's poisoned!" she cried. "Don't be silly," Peter said. He tipped the cup. Tinkerbell darted between the cup and his lips. In an instant she drank the potion on to the last drop to save Peter. She staggered backward. Already the deadly brew was working. She settled softly on Peter's shoulder. "Oh, Tink!" Peter exclaimed. "It really was poisoned. You did it to save me." He put his hand to his face. "Why, Tink? Why did you do it?" Tinkerbell raised herself to her feet and gave the tip of her nose a loving bite. She flew weakly to her bed and fell upon it. Peter poked his head into Tink's tiny room. Her light was flickering and growing faint. Once it was out, Tink would be gone forever. Peter began to cry. Large teardrops ran down his face. Tink whispered weakly, Peter put his ear close to hear what she was saying. I can get well as again if children believe in fairies, she said softly. Peter threw up his hands. But there are no children here, he said. Then he thought of all the children of the world who were sleeping and dreaming of Neverland. Don't let Tink die, he cried out to them. If you believe in fairies, clap your hands. Tink sat up to listen for the children's answer. From all around the world came the faint sound of children clapping. Not all of them, of course, but enough to save Tink. Her voice grew strong. Then she popped out of bed. In seconds she was darting around the room, as bright as and merry as before. And now to rescue Wendy, Peter shouted. He dashed to the hollow tree and in an instant popped out into the world above. The moon was bright. Peter wanted to fly, but if he did, his shadow would trail through the trees and disturb the birds. Their chirping would alert the pirates of his coming. He would have to sneak through the forest like an Indian. He was quite excited for this, like every adventure. It would be great fun. Chapter 10. The Pirate Ship. The pirates carried the children to Captain Hook's ship, the Jolly Roger, lying at anchor on Kidd's Creek, near the mouth of the Pirate River. The grim craft was covered with the bloody stain of piracy and war. The children were locked into a big bellow. The men leaned over the ship low rails, standing at the ink-black sea, or sat on deck playing cards or dice. Smee, whom they despised because he was so pathetic, sat at his sewing machine, quietly at work. Hook paced the dark deck, deep in thought. He had just rid himself of Peter forever, and the children were doomed to walk the plank. But there was no joy on the captain's dark face. On the contrary, he was dejected and alone. No little children loved me, he thought. The idea had not bothered him before, but now as he watched Smee, it did. Children thought Smee was lovable, though Smee himself thought children feared him. Hook wanted to clout Smee with his iron claw, but stopped short. Unhappiness overwhelmed him. Why did children love him? Hook wondered. The answer terrified him. Good form. Smee's sense of fair play was indeed why children loved him. Hook quickly turned his attention to the children. Are they chained so they can't fly away? He bellowed. Aye, sir, answered the pirate. Then hoist them up, Hook ordered. All but Wendy was dragged from the hoard and lined up in front of Captain Hook. Hook struck his chin. 6 of you will walk the plank tonight, he said, with a hint of pleasure in his voice. But 2 of you I need for cabin boys. Which of you will they be? I don't think my mother would want me to be a pirate, Toothless said the same, and so did the twins. Hook was annoyed. Stop the gab, he roared, and then turned to John. You look like you want to be a pirate, my hearty, he said. Truth was, sometimes in school John had thought about being a pirate. I once thought I could call myself Red-Handed Jack, John replied. Hook beamed. A good name, that, he said. And what about you? He asked, turning to Micah. What would my name be if I joined? Micah asked. Blackbeard Joe, Hook said. Micah was impressed. What do you think, John? He asked his brother. Would we have to give up our citizenship? John asked. You would have to swear. Down with the king, Hook demanded. Then I refuse, John said, banging his fist on the barrel. And so do I, Michael joined in. The lost boys shouted their approval. Then your fate is seared, Hook shouted. Bring up their mother, he ordered, and prepare the plank. The boys were frightened, but each tried to look brave, and Wendy was brought up from below. "So, my beauty," Hook said in a voice dripping with honey, "you are here to see your children walk the plank, eh?" "Are they to die?" Wendy asked. "Yes," Hook said sharply. "If you have any last words for them, speak them now." Wendy looked into each boy's face. "These are the last words our mothers would say to their children," she said firmly. "I hope you will be brave and die like English gentlemen." The pirate was awed. The boys stared at one another. "We will do as our mother wishes," they said. "Silence!" Hook shouted. Tie her to the mast." Smee tied Wendy to the mast in the center of the foul ship. "I'll save you if you promise to be my mother," he whispered into her ear. Wendy shook her head. "Never," she said scornfully. The boys weren't watching Wendy. Their eyes was glued to the plank. Their thought was on the last rock they would soon take. Hook grinned fiendishly. Suddenly the grin turned to horror. The night breeze carried it with it the steady tick, tick, tick of the fearsome crocodile. "The crocodile is going to board my ship," he exclaimed. The terrified captain farted the deck and crawled as fast as he could to a dark corner. "Hide me!" Hook shouted. His men formed a tight circle around him. The moment Hook was out of sight, the boys rushed to the rear. To their great joy and surprise, it was not the toothsome crocodile climbing the side of the ship. It was Peter. Peter put his finger to the grinning lips to quiet the boys and then went on ticking. Chapter 11. Hook or me this time. Hook or me this time. Peter had sneaked through the jungle unseen. Midway to Kidd's Creek, he passed the crocodile that, as always, was on Hook's trail. It was not ticking because the clock had run down. Peter grinned as a clever idea occurred to him. He imitated the ticking sound. It was perfect. Even the crocodile thought it was real and began to follow Peter. Peter swam easily across the open water to the ship. He scampered up its side, start ticking. "It will be Hook or me this time," he thought as he hoisted himself over the rail. The boys stood silently by so they would not give him away. At that moment, the quartermaster came along the deck. Peter pushed him over the rail. "One down," slightly whispered, and began to keep count. Captain Hook peered from his hiding place behind the ring of men. The ticking sound had stopped. He emerged as if he had not been scared out of his wits. His eyes glowed red, and his scowl turned sinister once more. "Get these boys to Johnny Plank," he ordered. He leaped onto the plank and began to dance along the precarious length. A devilish grin crossed his face as he sang, "Yo ho ho, the frisky plank you walk along is so till it goes down, and you goes down, and you goes down, the Davy Jones below." Hook jumped to the deck, but first a bit of a whip for these prisoners, he said. "No!" the boys shouted. "Jukes!" The pirates hurried to the cabin to fetch a decayed cat-o'-nine tails. "Peter is in the cabin," slightly whispered to the cowering boys. A dreadful screech burst from the dark cabin. "What was that?" he cried. "Two done," slightly said with a grin. Another pirate dashed into the cabin, but burst out a second later. "Jukes is gone!" he gasped. "There's something terrible in there." Hook eyed his men. "Get in there and see what it is," he hissed at Seko. Seko entered the cabin cautiously. Another horrible screech split the air. "Three," slightly said. The pirate captain turned to Starkey. "I believe I heard you volunteer," he said. "No," Starkey said defiantly. "I won't go in there." "So it's mutiny, is it?" Hook growled. Starkey glanced at the ring of pirates gathered around Captain Hook. None of them moved. Starkey eyed the dark cabin and then the captain's gleaming iron hook. Neither choice looked good. He spun on his heel and leaped over the rear into the sea. "Four," slightly whispered to the other boys. Hook polished his claw against his coat. "If one of you won't go, I'll fetch that cat myself," he said. He grabbed a flickering lantern and walked to the cabin door, slightly pursed his lips, ready to count 5. But Hook staggered out before any damage was done. "Something blew out the lights," he muttered. "Someone's aboard who doesn't belong." A pilot said, "Maybe it's the devil." "The ship is doomed," another cried. Hook touched his nose with the tip of his hook. "Send the prisoners in," he said. "If they beat what's in there, or it beats them, we'll be none the worse." The pirates shoved the boys into the cabin and slammed the door behind them. They turned away so they would not have to witness what was sure to follow. Inside the cabin, Peter unlocked the chains binding the boys. They all found weapons and, on Peter's hushed command, sneaked to the door unseen. Peter ran to Wendy and cut her bonds with his dagger. And nothing prevented Peter and the children from flying to safety. But Peter's vow rang in his ears. "Hook or me this time," he had said. They would fight to the finish. Peter wrapped Wendy's cloak around himself and put his back to the mast as Wendy hid in the darkness with the boys. Peter uttered a loud scream. The pirates were certain the noise signaled the end of the boys. They were panic-stricken. Whatever was in the cabin would surely come out for them now. Hook sensed mutiny. He quickly turned to the mast. "It's the girl," he snarled. "A woman on a pirate ship brings bad luck. When she's gone, we'll get rid of what's in the cabin." He raised his clawed arm. "Throw her overboard," he shouted. The pirates dashed for the cloaked figure at the mast. It was time for Peter to strike. He threw the cloak to the deck and brandished his dagger. "Peter Pan!" Hook screamed. At once he and his men knew what it was and what lurked inside the cabin. His black heart thumped with fear. But the fight had gone out of him. "Get him!" he ordered, but his voice was weak. "Attack, boys!" Peter shouted to the children. They burst from their hiding place and went straight for the pirates. One by one, the pirates fell or were tossed overboard. Slightly could scarcely keep count. The din of battle echoed over the water until at last only one pirate remained. The band of boys surrounded him with their gleaming swords high in the air. "Put away your swords, boy," Peter shouted. He jumped into the circle to face Captain Hook alone. "This one is mine," he said. Hook glared at Peter. "Prepare to meet thy doom," he hissed. The pirate captain leaped at Peter with his hook and sword slashing in the air. Peter quickly danced out of danger. He thrust with his own sword to nip Hook's coat. Hook nimbly escaped a more serious blow. He slashed back at Peter. Again, Peter parried the captain's attack. Again and again, the two exchanged strikes. Again and again, they avoided the worst. A sudden thrust by Peter sent Hook's sword flying to the deck. Disarmed, Hook was doomed, but Peter blew graciously and allowed his evil foe to recover the fallen weapon. Hook was enraged by Peter's good form. "Who are you?" Captain Hook shouted, still fighting for his life. "I'm Youth and Joy," Peter exclaimed, still pursuing his faltering prey. The two fought on, but Hook was clearly finished. In desperation, the pirate gave up the fight. He dashed into the powder warehouse and lit the fuse of a powerful cannonball. "The ship will be blown to pieces in 2 minutes," Hook cried. He desperately wanted to see Peter turn tail and flee for his life. Peter rushed into the warehouse. He grabbed the spluttering bomb and hurled it overboard as calmly as if it were a scrap of bread from a passing girl. Once more, Peter's good form got the better of Hook. Outfought and outwitted, Hook was beaten in every way. He staggered to the rear and climbed climb to its top. If he could not win, he could escape, even though it meant showing the worst form of R. With his black locks and long tail coat flying in the wind, Hook prepared to leap into the sea. He stared down at the dark water. A pair of eyes stared back. The crocodile snapped its powerful jaws. Hook shudders. He turned his back to Peter. Peter stepped forward and with a swift kick sent Hook toppling into the sea. Bad form, Hook jeered as he vanished forever. The pirates were beaten. Peter and the boys raised a victory cheer as Wendy stepped out from the shadows. It's very late, she said, and time for bed. Without protest, the exhausted children lay down and soon were fast asleep. Chapter 12. The Return Home. The pirate ship plowed through the sea with the crew of children and its captain, Peter Pan, at the helm. With luck, they would reach the Azores by the end of June. It would be easy to fly home from there. Wendy, John, and Michael had been gone for a very long time. They were eager to return and look forward to the surprise of their mother's face. In the meantime, Mr. and Mrs. Darling waited. Mrs. Darling kept the nursery just as it was, although Nana Kennel was moved out between 9 and 6 o'clock. Mr. Darling thought it was his fault the children were gone, since it was he who had chained Nana in the yard that fateful night. He was so ashamed of his actions that he deferred to Nana and followed her wishes completely. To show his remorse, he stayed in the kennel and refused to come out. The first one to reach the house was number 14, where Peter Pan and Tinkerbell. They flew to the open window. "Quick, Tink," Peter said. Close the window and bar it. When Wendy returns, she'll think her mother does not want her back. Then she'll come back to Neverland with me." Peter had planned this trick all along. He did not want Wendy to return home at all. He flew to another window and glanced in. "It's Mrs. Darling," he exclaimed. The children's mother had fallen asleep on the piano. "She's pretty, but not as pretty as my mother," Peter said. Of course, Peter didn't know his own mother, but even though he liked to say that he did. "You will never see Wendy again," he whispered. 2 fresh tears sparkled on Mrs. Darling's cheeks. Peter stared at them. "She's awfully fond of Wendy," he said. "She wants the window open so the children can come back. But then Wendy won't be able to stay with me. We can't both have her." He could not take his eyes off Mrs. Darling's sad face. "Oh, all right," he gulped. He quickly opened the nursery window. "Come on, Tink. We don't want any silly mothers." He turned his back to the window and flew away. Soon Wendy, John, and Michael reached the house. The window was open for them after all. They flew inside and landed gently on the floor. Each looked around as if they had forgotten it was their home. "I think I've been here before," Michael said. "Of course you have, silly," John replied. "There's your bed and there's the kennel." "Maybe Nana is inside now," Michael exclaimed. Just then a noise from the hall warned the children that someone was coming. "It's Mother," Wendy exclaimed. "Then you're not really our mother?" Michael asked in a sleepy voice. Wendy shook her head. She pointed to the bed. "Quickly," she said. "Get into bed, as if we've never been away." The children jumped into their bed and pulled up the covers. When Mrs. Darling peeked into the room, she saw at once that all the beds were full. She was sure she was dreaming. She sat down in her chair, just as she had when they were babies. "Mother!" Wendy cried. "That's Wendy," Mrs. Darling said. "Mother!" John shouted. "That's John," Mrs. Darling said. "Mother!" Michael cried. "And that's Michael," Mrs. Darling said, certain at last it was not a dream. She stretched out her arms for her children, who leaped out of bed and ran to her. "George! George!" Mrs. Darling called to her husband. She wrapped her arms tightly around the children and held them very close. "They've never never was a lovelier sight. Mr. Darling woke and came running with Nana close on his heels. Outside the window was a smart face staring into the cozy room. It was the little boy whose life was filled with adventure and joy. But now, looking in through the window, Peter Pan saw the one joy he would never ever know. The lost boys were waiting outside. Wendy quickly explained to her mother that they would like to come in too. Soon slightly toothless, curly Nips and the twins were in the children's room. They were still dressed in their pirate clothes. Each boy looked into Mrs. Darling's eyes as if to say, "May we please stay?" Mrs. Darling agreed immediately to let the boys stay, but Mr. Darling was not so sure. After all, there were 6 of them, and the Darlings already had 3 children. If we would be too much of a handful, we will go away," the first twin said. "We will share a bed," Nib said. "I will cut their hair," Wendy said. "We will fit in, sir," Toothless said. Mr. Darling nodded. "Yes," he said. "You can stay." "Hoopla!" the boys shouted, and they all danced through the house with joy. They finally had a real home. As for Peter, he saw Wendy one last time before returning to Neverland. He flew past the window, and Wendy opened it to let him in. "Goodbye, Wendy," he said. "Are you really going?" Wendy asked. Mrs. Darling entered the room. She smiled at Peter and asked him to stay. "Would you send me to school?" Peter asked. "Of course," Mrs. Darling replied. "And I would have to grow up?" Peter said. "Of course," Mrs. Darling replied. "I don't want to grow up," Peter said. "I'm going back to Neverland to live with Tink in a house in the trees." He glanced at Wendy. "It will be such fun," he said, hoping she would go with him. "May I go with Peter, Mother?" Wendy asked. "Of course not," Mrs. Darling said. "But he needs a mother," Wendy said. "And so do you," answered Mrs. Darling. "But you may visit Peter once each spring to help him with spring cleaning." Wendy agreed, though she would have preferred to go right then. She turned to Peter. "You won't forget me, will you, Peter?" she asked. "Of course not," Peter promised, and then he flew away. Soon the lost boys were in school. Some did well, while others had to struggle. After a time, they all forgot how to fly, even Michael. They no longer believed they could. Peter came for Wendy the next year, but she was surprised to learn he had already forgotten many of their adventures together. He didn't even remember Captain Hook or Tinker Bell because his head was filled with new adventures. The next year, Wendy waited for Peter to wane. He did not come. Many more years passed, and Wendy was quite grown up. She didn't mind at all that she was grown. In fact, she liked it. Peter became a distant memory. The boys grew up too, and each went his own way in life, just as they should. Wendy married and had a daughter of her own, named Jane, who was just as inquisitive as her mother. Jane loved to hear her mother tell of the boy who visited the nursery. Jane lived in the same nursery Wendy did when she was little. One night after Wendy finished telling a story, Peter Pan himself flew in the window. He had no idea so many years had passed, for he was still a boy. Wendy felt strange because she was grown up and Peter had not changed one bit. "Hello, Wendy," Peter said. "Hello, Peter," Wendy replied. Peter glanced around the room. "Where is John?" he asked. "And where is Michael?" "They aren't here anymore," Wendy said. "Have you forgotten that this is spring cleaning time?" Peter asked. "I can't go with you, Peter," Wendy said. "I've forgotten how to fly. I'm grown up now. I'll soon teach you again." Peter said. "Please, Peter, don't waste the fairy dust on me," Wendy replied. Peter was afraid for the first time in his life. "No," he said, but it was too late. The moment Wendy turned up the light, he saw she was a woman and not a little girl. Peter sat on the floor and began to cry. His sobs woke Jane. "Why are you crying, boy?" Jane asked. They were the very words Wendy first said to Peter many years before. Peter stood quickly and bowed very low. "My name is Peter Pan," he said. "Yes, I know," Jane said. "I've been waiting for you." When Wendy returned, she discovered Peter sitting on the bedpost and Jane flying through the room. "She's my mother," Peter said to Wendy. Wendy shook his head slightly. "Sadly, yes," she said. "Nobody knows that as well as I." Peter flew into the air. "Goodbye, Wendy," he said. Jane flew to join him, and the two darted to the window. "No!" Wendy shouted as she ran to the window. "It's just for spring cleaning time," Jane said to her mother. Wendy knew she could not hold them back. Peter flew out the window, and Jane trailing joyfully behind. "If only I could go with you," Wendy sighed. When Jane grew up, she also had a daughter. When spring cleaning time came, she too flew off with Peter Pan to be his mother. And so it will be forever, as long as there are little children. The end of Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie.